All right, good morning. We're going to read from 2 Timothy chapter 4, it'll be verses 9 through 22. It can be found on page 936 and also on the screen if you would like to watch for any mispronunciations. All right, verse 9. Do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did great harm, and the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. At first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his kingdom, his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Great Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained at Corinth, and I left Trophimus, who was ill, at Miletus. Do your best to come before winter. Eubulus sends greetings to you, and so do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you.
So one of the things that I love about this church is the wide variety of people who attend. When I show up here on a Sunday morning, I'll run into 3-year-olds through 6-year-olds running, jumping up and down the stairs with donuts smeared all over their face. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are those who use the elevator and the ramp to make it up here safely. Wide variety. We have people who are single. We have married people. We have divorced people. We have those who like the Broncos. We even have some Chiefs fans trying to change that around here, trying to bring about excommunication once again, but elders don't seem to be on board for that particular reason. Wide variety of people, right? We got people who love to be outside, love to go up in the mountains. We have others who like to stay home and knit and sew and do all kinds of indoor activities. We've got Republicans, we've got Democrats. I mean, we've got it all. We have got a wide variety of people in this church. But I will say that though we have a lot of differences, there are some similarities as well. There are some things that we all share in common. And I would suggest that one thing that we probably all share in common, I'm just kind of guessing this is the case, but I think I'm probably right. One thing we all share in common is my suspicion is that every single one of us has had an experience where somebody let us down. Am I right about this? Can I get a show of hands? Go ahead, be honest. Go ahead, and if you don't put it up, I think you're lying, right? I mean, we have all had an experience where someone has let us down. Maybe somebody very close to us. Maybe a friend or a relative has let us down. Maybe it was in a work environment where a coworker stabbed you in the back, or an employer didn't look out for you and let you down. Again, maybe it was a family member, a brother, a sister, a parent. Maybe it was someone in the church. Maybe it was a fellow Christian in the church that lets you down, right? How many of us can resonate with this? How many of us have been let down by the church? Let down by people in the church. And my suspicion is that that's probably something we can all resonate with. The question is how do we respond? What do we do when people let us down? What do we do when people in the church let us down? Today we are finishing up our series called Fan into Flame, a series on the book of 2 Timothy. We're finishing it up this week, which means that next week we're going to launch into a brand new series. This is a series on the book of Isaiah. This is a series called Hope in the Shadow. And this is going to coincide with the season of Advent, right? Advent starts next Sunday, the 4 Sundays before Christmas. And Advent is really a season where we are invited to sort of relive the story of the people of Israel as they were waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And we're gonna do that. Our sort of guide to sort of reliving that story is going to be from the book of Isaiah. So this series, this 4-week series, comes out of the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah, of course, lived in this period, as we're going to see, a very dark period in Israelite history. It was a period where a great shadow had come over the people of Israel. It was a time when people had good reason to not be very optimistic. But what we're going to see is that it's precisely in this incredibly dark time that Isaiah prophesies about the coming of the Messiah, that he prophesies about the greatest source of hope imaginable. In this dark season is when he proclaims the great hope of the gospel. And so our hope is, as we look at the book of Isaiah, it will encourage us that whatever challenges we may be facing, whatever dark shadow may be looming over our own lives, we can see that there is indeed hope in the shadow. So that's going to be starting next week, a 4-week series. But today, again, we're finishing up this series on 2 Timothy called Fan into Flame. And this is a letter that Paul, a man named Paul, wrote to a mentee of his, a disciple of his. And as we've seen, one of the primary purposes of this letter is to fan into flame the sense of calling and purpose in Timothy's life. Paul sees Timothy and sees that he may be getting discouraged, he may be getting beaten down, and his sense of calling and purpose in life, like a little flame that's getting snuffed out. Paul wants to come and fan that into flame, and our hope is that the letter would do the same thing for us. That as we read this letter, it encourages us, as we've seen throughout this series, as followers of Jesus, you are given a calling. You are given purpose in your life. Your life is not meaningless when you surrender it to God. And we've seen that God calls each of us to our own specific callings. He gifts us to live out the purposes that he has specifically for our own lives. But what we've also seen is that those smaller callings, smaller purposes, all fit underneath a grand and more general purpose that is incumbent on all of us. As all Christians, ultimately, there's one big purpose that we are all after, and we saw what this was. We saw this a few weeks ago in chapter 4. Let me read for you where this emerges here. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 2 says this: I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom, and here it is, preach the word. And we saw when we looked at this a few weeks ago that what he really means there is to proclaim the gospel. That's what he means by the word. Proclaim the gospel. Live a life that points people to the reality of who God is as is revealed in Jesus. That's our ultimate calling, is to live lives, the way we act and the things that we say that point people to the reality of God's love for us in Jesus. We looked at John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. We saw that's a great verse that sort of summarizes what the hope of the gospel is all about. And one of the things that we saw is that God is a relational God. God longs to be in relationship with us. He loves us, and he wants to be in relationship with us. And we're called then to invite people to acknowledge this God who really loves them and cares for them and wants to know them and them to know him, to be in this relationship. So we see it's all about pointing people to Jesus. Now, something emerges from this general calling. There's something that is inherent in this calling that we need to see, and it's something that I would suggest emerges in this passage. And here's what it is. to be called by God means we are in the people business. Right? I mean, if the hope of the gospel is that God longs to be in relationship with people, and if he's called us to help point people to him, then that means that we, by necessity, need to be all about people. We are in the people business. You know, there's an interesting verse in one of Paul's letters. There's this letter where Paul is in prison, and it looks like he's actually about to be killed. He doesn't know if he's going to be killed or not. And he's kind of reflecting on, I wonder if it would, if I die, would it be better if I lived, or it would be better if I died? He's like going back and forth. And this is what he says. This is the letter that he wrote to the church in Philippi. This is what he says. He says, I'm pressed between the two, between life and death. My desire, get this, is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. You see what he's saying? This is pretty mind-blowing, this perspective that he has. What he's saying is, like, if it was really just all about me and what's best for me, he's like, if I died, I'm just going to be with the Lord. He's like, what could be better than that? So he's like, well, then I guess the reason I'm here on the earth then isn't for me. Well, my only reason for being here is for you. You see this? Imagine what a perspective shift that would be if we all took that. If we realized our whole reason for being here was for the sake of other people, right? And this is the point. We are called to be in the people business. And of course, this is what we see when we come to the end of this letter. We discover that Paul is all about people. We discover in this section here that 17 different specific individuals are named, which, by the way, Kevin Beckman, you nailed it. I mean, you did great, right? I'm sure you're like, come on, Hanley, really? This is the passage that actually, it's Betty. You can blame Betty. She's the one that picks the scripture readers. That wasn't on me. But you did a great job. By the way, with a lot of these names, we really have no idea how they pronounce them, so the key is just say it with confidence. That's all that really matters. But I thought you did a great job. I'm going to read them myself. I'm going to take a stab at this myself. Let's just listen to this. These are 17 individuals that are named right here in this last part of the letter. Here we go. Demons, Cretians, Titus, Luke, Mark, Tychicus, Carpus, Alexander, Priscilla, Aquila, Onesiphorus, Erastus, Trophimus, Eubulus, Pudens, Linus, and Claudia. I tell you what, there's some sick names in there, am I right? I think so. I mean, look, we have a number of families in this church that are with child. We're excited about that, and you might be kind of thinking about baby names. Reichert's back there, Jordan, Jessica, I got one for you. You guys ready for this? Tell me, would this not be awesome? I want you to just consider this. Here's a possible name. Here's what it is. Trophimus Eubulus Reichert. Come on, man. Are you serious? That is a sick name. I'm just saying. How about this one? We're the Bears. Sarah and Alex. Here we go. Ready for this? I know you want to name, if you have a boy, you want to name him Alexander, or it could be Alexandra. How about just simply Alexander Onesiphorus Bear? Right? I mean, can you imagine he gets in trouble? Alexander Onesiphorus, get over right now. I mean, I would be terrified if that, right? I'm just saying, some sick names here. If you're with child, you might want to consider 2 Timothy 4, last chapter. Look at some of these names. Anyway, okay, so Paul, we see in these names that Paul is absolutely a people person. In verse 9, he asks Timothy to come to him. Paul is in prison in Rome. He asks Timothy to come. And then in verse 13, he gives him some more specific instructions. This verse has garnished a fair amount of scholarly attention. Let me read it for you. It says this, when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments. Now, there's some debate about exactly what is he referring to when he talks about the books and the parchments. Most scholars would agree that the word books there, really, it would be better translated as just scrolls. That would be scrolls. So these would be papyrus scrolls or leather scrolls, possibly containing Old Testament scriptures, maybe even, for example, one of the Isaiah scrolls. Right, we're going to be looking at Isaiah here. He might have had, Isaiah would have taken a number of scrolls for all of Isaiah, but he might have had that. He wants his Bible. He wants his Old Testament scriptures. That may be what he's referring to there. And then when he talks about the parchments, there are some who argue that here we might actually see sort of the beginning form of what would eventually become the modern book. What's fascinating is that the modern book, with its binding in the middle, the reality is that Christians were actually very instrumental in the invention of the modern book. And it seems that what happened was the Christians, they had the Gospels. They had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they wanted to be able to have all of those Gospels in the same place. But they wouldn't all fit on a scroll, and so it seems like they came up with this idea, or at least advanced this idea, of sewing them together in the middle to create a book. So it seems like the formation of the Bible was instrumental in the whole idea of the book. Now, I don't actually think that's what's going on here. I don't think it makes sense chronologically that would be what's going on here. I think one possibility when he mentions these parchments is that he's simply talking about blank sheets of paper. He's asking for blank sheets of paper. He's in prison, and I think that would actually fit Paul's situation quite well. Because remember, Paul, as we're seeing, was a people person. Paul was in prison, and it would have been difficult for him to engage people, which is what he loved to do. And so what's he going to do? How's he going to engage people? Well, one way we see is by writing letters, doing exactly what he does here with Timothy. So I think there's a possibility he wants paper so he can write letters. It's the one thing that he can do. And some of you might consider that. Some of you, for any different reason, may find yourself homebound, maybe because of health issues or any other issue that you may have. Maybe you sometimes feel imprisoned in your home. You want to get out, want to do more. Well, have you ever thought about this? You can still have an impact on people by writing letters, writing emails, sending text messages as a way of encouraging people. So let that be an example to you. No matter where you are, that's something that you can do and still be in the people business, right? All of this is just pointing to this central fact that Paul was a people person, and as people are called by God on to live out his purposes, we need to be people in the people business as well, just as Paul was. Now, something further emerges if we're going to be like Paul, if we're going to be people in the people business, here's something that we need to see that emerges from Paul's description of these individuals. And here's what it is. Your experience of people will have ups and downs. There's going to be good experiences. There's going to be bad experiences, right? Negative experiences, positive experiences. Let's start with the negative experiences. We see this. As he describes these 17 people, we get a little bit of a glimpse into what he thought of some of these people. Let's start with the negative. Chapter 4, verse 10. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Maybe Demas isn't the best baby name. Let's leave that one off. Yeah, he doesn't have a good reputation. So Demas... We don't know exactly what happened, but it seems that he deserted him. That's the word that Paul uses. He feels alienated by Demas. How many of us have ever had that kind of an experience? Where maybe somebody that you worked with, maybe somebody you were in ministry with, maybe a friend of yours or whatever, somewhere along the way, they desert you. They turn their back on you. Right? This is exactly what Paul experiences. We find another negative experience, verse 14. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Alexander the coppersmith. There have been a number of attempts to try to identify who this Alexander is. There are a number of Alexanders mentioned in the Bible, several in the New Testament. The truth is, Alexander was a really popular name. Alexander the Great had several hundred years before had come and conquered the whole area, and everybody liked to name their kid after Alexander. So a lot of Alexanders. We don't know which Alexander it was, but clearly, this one, right? He did me great harm. So we see this here. Like if you're going to be in the people business, right? Don't be surprised if it doesn't always go well. Don't be surprised if you have bad experiences. Now, I think there are two lessons that we can learn from just these two examples. The first one is this. Is that when there is a breach in a relationship between you and someone else, don't necessarily take it personally, right? I mean, sometimes it might be something that you did, and of course you always want to explore that try to reach out to them, try to reconcile with them. But I think we see in the case of Demas that he just says, Demas, who's in love with the present world. You know, what he's saying, essentially what he's saying is, look, Demas's heart, right? He's been pulled away, pulled into sin would be another way of putting this, pulled away into his longings and desires for things that are not of God's world, but of this world. He's saying, look, that's what did it, right? I mean, sometimes when somebody bails on you, it's nothing to do with you. It's just they're getting pulled into idolatry. They're being pulled into sin. And so we shouldn't necessarily take it personally when there is a breach in a relationship. Secondly, when there is a breach in a relationship, when somebody has wronged you, and this is really important, we need to see that vengeance is the Lord's, not ours. And we see this with this Alexander the coppersmith fellow. Verse 14, Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Now, when you hear that, you're like, well, that's a little harsh. Yee, he's kind of a little bitter, Paul. But actually, we need to realize that what Paul's saying is that I'm not going to retaliate. I'm not going to take this into my own hands. I'm going to leave it in the Lord's hands. I'm going to turn the other cheek, as it were, right? And this, of course, taps into something that Jesus himself said in Matthew 5. Says this, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, what is it that enables the Christian to do this, to not retaliate, to turn the other cheek? And crucial to this, our understanding of this, is the idea that God is a God of justice, and God will make all wrongs right, so you don't have to. You don't have to take it into your own hands. You know, there are some who think that belief in a wrathful God, a God of judgment, if you believe in a God of judgment, then that's going to make you wrathful and judgmental. But I would suggest that rightly understood, it's the very opposite. It's precisely because we know we worship a God of justice who will not let evil go undealt with, that we can leave it in his hands and trust that he will ultimately deal with it justly. Right? So these are just two principles that emerge that can help us when we find ourselves in situations that don't always go well. Because if we're going to be people in the people business, there are going to be ups and downs. There's going to be going to be negative experiences, but then of course there's also going to be positive experiences, and we see this as well, beginning in verse 11. It says here, Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you. Right? I love that, right? Luke and Mark. Who are Luke and Mark? Oh, I don't know. Only the two individuals who wrote the Gospels of Mark and Luke? Right? They wrote the Bible, tell us who Jesus is. He's just like Luke and Mark. They're Luke and Mark, right? I love it. I love when you look at the early Christian community, they were like a tight community. When you look at those to whom tradition attributes the New Testament, they were all part of a community. They knew each other. Paul traveled with Mark. Mark went on one of his missionary journeys. We discover that Luke also traveled with Paul at various times throughout his missionary work. So Paul knew these individuals, and we see that he thinks of them very fondly. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. We see a very positive experience there. Go on to verse 12. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. We discover that this Tychicus or Tychicus, how Kevin said, who knows? Tychicus, Tychicus. Tomato, right, buddy? Yeah. It's okay, whatever. Yeah. Wait, who told you to say that? Oh, you did. I was like, did chat tell you that? You're gonna go with chat? No, okay. Anyway, that's another conversation. All right, so Tychicus, or however you want to pronounce his name, we discover that elsewhere, this is not the first time Paul sends him to Ephesus. We discover that Tychicus is actually the individual who delivered to Ephesus, delivered the letters of Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon earlier on in Paul's ministry. So there's these crucial letters which are part of the New Testament Tychicus was the one who delivered them to their recipients. He would have been the one, he would have read the letters to them, and then he would have answered any questions that they had about these letters. So this is someone that Paul valued very much and trusted significantly. Going on to verse 13. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. Now, we don't know for sure. We can just kind of infer maybe what's going on here. Troas is up in, let's see, it would be northwestern Turkey or northwestern Asia, as it would have been called there. Right on the coast, overlooking the Hellespont. Those of you who love like Greek culture, the Greek wars with Persia and all that, was a very crucial area looking over the Hellespont, this sort of strait of water that was people were able to cross to go from Asia into Macedonia. Well, that's where Troas was, right there, sort of a gateway into Macedonia. And Paul went through Troas a number of different times throughout his missionary work, and we can infer from this that maybe the reason he left his cloak with Carpus is because that's where he would stay. That Carpus provided hospitality for him anytime he went through Troas, right? So we see, again, another positive experience that Paul has. Then in jumping down to verse 19, it says, greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Now let me give you a little bit of background to help understand this. In the year 49 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius kicked out the Jews and Jewish Christians, kicked them out of Rome. And this was significant for a number of different reasons. God, in his providence, used it in a number of different ways. For one thing, if that hadn't happened, Paul probably never would have written the book of Romans, which is one of his most significant letters. He writes it to them years later when the Jewish Christians were allowed to return to Rome, and there was all kinds of tension between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians upon their return. And so Paul writes Romans to try to help deal with that tension there. He probably wouldn't have written it if they hadn't been kicked out. But there's another way in which God used this expulsion of the Jewish Christians, and that is that one couple, that was expelled from Rome, were Priscilla sometimes, Priscilla and Aquila, this Jewish Christian couple, and they ended up relocating to the city of Corinth. And it turned out that they ended up in Corinth just before Paul showed up in Corinth himself on his second missionary journey. And if you discover what was going on in his second missionary journey, he's getting chased out of like every town in Greece. People are trying to kill him. He has to send Timothy back to Thessalonica to make sure they're doing okay. He may even have been alone when he comes in to Corinth, kind of running for his life. And it seems that he comes into Corinth, and that's where he meets Priscilla and Aquila. Like God providentially provides this couple who are also there in the same business. Paul was a tent maker. They were tent makers. And so it seems like a relationship was established very quickly, and they served together in ministry. They worked together. And it seems like they were only together for a few years, and then they went separate directions. And Paul went his direction. They went their direction. But it's clear there was this very strong bond that was established between them. I don't know how many of you can relate to that. How many of us have individuals in our lives that maybe they come into your life for just a brief period of time, but they have an incredible impact on your life, and you forge a lifelong friendship that even though you don't see each other much anymore, you have that, right? I know when I think of Priscilla and Aquila, I think of, for Laura and I, there's a family, Emily and Nathan Dietrich. And we met them. We were serving in New Jersey. They came to New Jersey at the same time, and we were with them for about 4 years, doing ministry together, raising our kids together, just doing life together. And then we went our separate ways. They ended up going to Pennsylvania. We moved to Colorado. But there's this lifelong bond that is there because of that time together. And I would suggest the same thing is true for Paul with Priscilla and Aquila. When he says, greet Prisca and Aquila, when he says that in verse 19, you can imagine this is probably full of emotion, full of really positive feelings towards these individuals, right? Okay, so you see Paul, right, he had negative relationships, negative experiences, and he had very positive experiences. Now, I should say, even with the positive experiences that he had, that doesn't mean they were always perfect. Right? I mentioned his relationship with with Mark. In verse 11, right, again, he says, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry." I have to think that Paul added that last phrase there as a way of reassuring Mark. And the reason is because you find out that earlier on in their relationship, there was a huge breach between them. That Paul felt like Mark abandoned him. He was on his first missionary journey, and Mark left, and it caused this huge rift between Paul and Mark, and actually Mark's whole family. And so here we see that relationship has been restored. And I think Paul is just trying to reassure Mark, hey, I do trust you, I love you, we're good, right? So we see this, right? That even with the positive relationships that he has, that doesn't mean that they are always perfect. Okay. So there we are. That's our little brief tour of Paul's relationships as they are contained in these verses here at the end. Now, I want to draw out two main themes that I think emerge from this. Here's the first one. We cannot live out God's calling on our lives without community. Right? Paul is sometimes people think of Paul as this individual this sort of superhero who single-handedly went across the Mediterranean world, setting the world on fire for Jesus. But what we discover is that at every step of the way, he was dependent on others. If it wasn't for Carpus, he might have frozen to death in Macedonia. If it wasn't for Tychicus, we never would have gotten Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon. If it weren't for Priscilla and Aquila, maybe his little passion for ministry would have died out while he was in Corinth. If it weren't for God sending them to sort of fan into flame his sense of calling and passion. We see him even now. He's longing for community. Right? He's asking Timothy to come and to bring Mark with him. But he also knows that that's going to leave the city of Ephesus, the community of Ephesus, in the lurch. So he's going to send Tychicus to go help out that community because he sees the importance of community. And I think this is something that we really need to reflect on, especially as 21st century Americans, because we live in an age and in a world where community does not happen naturally. It's very easy to go through life and not really have meaningful community, right? We've talked about this before. There's all kinds of evidence that essentially since the invention of the television, right, community ties have really suffered in America. Everybody would rather just sit at home and watch TV or do whatever. And so there's been huge breakdown in community. And I've used this analogy before, but I would say that then when we refuse to engage in community, when our lack of community, what we end up experiencing is very similar to the experience of the frog in the pot. You guys know what I'm talking about? Right? If you take a frog, at least I don't know if this is true or not. Might be an old wives' tale, but it's a good story either way. Okay. If you take a frog and you put him in a pot of water, room temperature water, and then you turn on the stove and you heat it up, right? It slowly heats it up. The frog doesn't realize what's going on until it's too late. He doesn't realize he's getting cooked to death until he's dead, or maybe he can't move. I don't know exactly how that works. And I would suggest that lack of community operates the same way. That when you aren't experiencing meaningful community, you don't realize the negative impact it's having on you. In fact, at first, you might even kind of like it, because you might even, a little bit like that little frog, like the water's warm. This is nice, Lack of community can be nice because people can be difficult, right? People can be frustrating or annoying, or they just take a lot of energy, right? And so it's just easier to just avoid people. It's nice and warm, like a little jacuzzi. But then as time goes by, and especially when trials come into your life, if you don't have that community, all of a sudden you find yourself in a deep spot of loneliness you didn't see coming. This is why there's all kinds of studies saying that Americans are as lonely as anybody's ever been in history. Like, we're just lonely people. And I would suggest it's because of this lack of community. So listen, let Paul's example serve for you as an example. Get in community. Be intentional about it, right? If you're not already in one of our community groups, we would encourage you to get involved in one. If you can't make the times that are available, we want to establish more. Any kind of gathering, or make sure you're gathering with others to establish community, because we see just how important it is. Okay, so we see that. We see the importance of community emerges here. But, secondly, community, even at its best, will sometimes let you down. So we need community, but we need to realize that even at its best, it will sometimes let us down. John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, God chose him to write about Jesus. He let Paul down. He let him down. Left him on a missionary journey, fled away. Paul was hurt by this. Right? If John Mark's going to let people down, I tell you what, we're all going to let people down. Everybody, you're going to experience being let down. Look, here's the truth. Paul himself let others down as well. If you read 2 Corinthians, you discover part of the reason he even writes that letter is because it's clear the church in Corinth feels like Paul has abandoned them. They feel let down by him. In fact, I would even suggest, if you read between the lines here, I think that there's somebody, one of the individuals that's mentioned, these 17 names, I wouldn't be surprised if he felt let down by Paul too. Right? Notice this here in verse 20. Here's what it says. Paul says this, Erastus remained at Corinth, and I left Trophimus, who was ill, at Miletus. How did Trophimus feel about that? Right? Oh, yeah, he's too sick. He's not keeping up. We'll just leave him in Miletus, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe Paul was careful to make sure that he had people supporting him, but I don't know. I think Miletus is like, come on, Paul, you're just gonna leave me here. I think Trophimus might have felt a little bit abandoned there. So listen, you're going to be let down. Paul let people down. He was let down. And of course, Paul says it very directly in verse 16. Look what he says here. At my first defense, here, Paul, he's in prison. He's going on trial. At my first defense, here it is, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. So my wife had me pick up this little plaque that has one of her favorite verses on it. Hang up in the living room. Probably all have that, like little plaques. Maybe you hang up on your wall, or maybe you just write out one of your favorite verses and you put it on your bathroom mirror, or you put on your bumper sticker. Verses Philippians 4:13, John 3:16, that sort of thing. My guess is that nobody has ever made a plaque or a bumper sticker of 2 Timothy 4:16, right? I mean, who puts that up on their wall? At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. Right? This is not a popular Bible verse, but I think that maybe it should be. Because it needs to remind us of our expectations. And it needs to it helps to remind us that even community at its best will let us down. Again, I asked at the beginning of this message, how many of us have ever felt let down by somebody close to us? How many of us have ever been let down by the church? And the question that emerges is, what do we do? What do we do when people let us down? What do we do when the church lets us down? What do we do when nobody stands by us? We find the answer if we read on. Again, beginning in verse 16. At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. And then here it is, verse 17. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Friends, the Lord will always stand by you. Friends, people will let you down. As you go through life, you're going to be let down. Teachers are going to let you down. The government's going to let you down. Your friends are going to let you down. Your family may even let you down. The church It will let you down. There will be times when it will let you down. But Jesus will never let you down. He will always be there. You see, this is the heart of the gospel. The heart of the Christian faith is that God loves us so much that in Jesus, he was willing to die for us. On the cross, he came in and he said, look, I'm not going to leave you even if I have to go to the death. I will not desert you. You see how this shows us the kind of God that we have. Some people will say, God is a God of love, God is with us, but it's in Jesus that we see the reality of this. That no matter what we face, if he's willing to go to death for us, we can trust that he will be with us no matter what we face. Okay? Maybe right now, you've got final exams coming up. God will be with you. You've got a job interview coming up. The Lord will stand by you. You may in the future find yourself lying on an MRI table, which is very alone. But the Lord will stand by you. You may find yourself going to the grave to bury somebody you love deeply. The Lord will be with you. Friends, as we wrap up this series has been all about the fact that we are called by God. Each and every one of us, if you are a follower of Jesus, there is meaning and purpose in your life. God has a plan for your life. But there are going to be times when that sense of passion for God's purpose in your life is going to start to feel like it's getting snuffed out. Life circumstances come and snuff it out. People desert you, comes and snuffs it out. And what do we need in the end to fan that flame is to know this: God will always stand by us. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity for us to be reminded once again that the Lord will always stand by you. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ. They point to the reality that we have a God who's willing to go even to death for us, and therefore we know he will never leave us or forsake us. And as we take the elements, may it bolster in us this great confidence to continue living on mission for him, regardless of whether others are with us or not. We know that he will always be with us.